So welcome everyone. My name is Kira Duke and I will be our host for today. This is of course another episode in our Discover Tennessee History webinar series. Hopefully you guys have been able to join us for one of our previous ones. If not, thank you guys for joining us today, and hopefully you'll have a chance to check out some of our upcoming ones or go back and watch video from some of the past sessions that we have done. So a couple quick housekeeping things before I turn things over to Chris. A couple of housekeeping things. We are recording today's session for inclusion on our TPS MTSU YouTube page, which is where you can find all of the sessions that we have recorded in this series. So if you would, just please be sure to keep your mics muted throughout. There may be a point in time where you'll be able to ask questions of our panelists today, and Chris will guide you on kind of how the procedures for how to do that exactly. If you would, find your name in the participant list and rename yourself. Make sure your first and last name are shown there. And that'll just help us. We respond to things in the chat box or call on folks to ask questions later on. We do want the session to be interactive. So again, go ahead and locate that chat box, open that up, take a moment to introduce yourself. You can also, of course, use the reaction buttons. You can find those there towards the bottom of your screen. You should have a hands clapping or a thumbs up. And for some of our sessions, we do utilize polling. I don't think we'll be doing that today, but that is something that occasionally we make use of. Oops. And of course, you can find all of the materials referenced in any of the sessions that we've done within this series on the Padlet page that we've done, and you can access that here. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and turn things over to Chris Grisham with the Tennessee State Museum.
Thank you. All right, looks like we've got a pretty good group today. Very excited to see everybody that was able to make it in here, that said that they were interested, and hopefully we're going to be able to have a really good discussion. I am Christopher Grisham. I work with the Tennessee State Museum, and officially my job title, I believe, is K-12 Education Manager, but basically I focus on the kind of formal school education side of what the museum does, including things like teacher workshops, the field trips, and virtual offerings that are kind of targeted at teachers and students. What we really wanted to do today, and like I said, hopefully you guys will be able to help us out as well, is really talk about something that's kind of been, over the last few years, has gotten a lot more attention, deservedly so, and talk about the inclusion of African-American history in classroom education. Obviously, that has changed a lot over the years. When I was in school, Black History Month was kind of where all of it fell. And then you just got the regular history the rest of the year. And that is not where we're at anymore, which is great. But being able to include that and the best ways to do that and the ways to kind of integrate it, we really want to find the best ways to do that. So we thought we could have this panel discussion with some of our experts and really work towards coming up with ways to help you guys in the classroom not only include African-American history into the classroom, but maybe help you guys find some resources or overcome some obstacles that you're hitting out there in the classroom where you are day in, day out. So we really want to help out with that as well. So basically, we'll kind of start the ball rolling by introducing our panelists so you know where everybody's coming from. Then we'll do a little bit of discussion with some questions we definitely want to answer. And then the goal is towards the end to make sure we have enough time for you guys, for teachers, to be able to address our panelists, ask questions, and provide each other with some help. If you've got things that you'd like to share with the group that have always worked for you, we really want that as well. All right, at any point throughout the talk, feel free to put any questions you have in the chat. When we get to the discussion part, I think our group's probably small enough that we'll be able to unmute and maybe get some actual conversation going, but the chat will be up and running throughout the whole thing. All right, I think I covered all the upfront stuff, so now we can really get into it. We only have about an hour. We'll be wrapping up about 5 o'clock, so I want to make sure we have plenty of time for the content. And to kick us off in the next bit, I'm going to introduce the museum's curator that is with us today, Bridget Jones. She is recent addition to the museum within the last year, and she is a social history curator who focuses on the diverse communities of Tennessee. So African American history, Latino history, and Middle Eastern are just a few of those. But that is her focus. You are a Tennessee native, and by the way, correct me at any point if I get any of this wrong. From Memphis, graduated from TSU, and you most recently you came to us from Belmont, was it not?
Belmead Plantation.
Belmead. See, I knew it was going to get me. I said it in my head several times earlier today because I knew that was going to happen. All right. Bridget, I'm actually going to throw it over to you. Anything else you want to say about yourself, feel free to brag a little bit. You're welcome to do that. But then I'm going to let you introduce the rest of our panelists.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for attending today. We really appreciate you. This is a really important subject. This has definitely got some interesting stories in the past year or so that have been circulating concerning how teachers have been teaching African American history. So we're just here to offer some best practices and answer any questions that you may have on how to better teach this very touchy subject. Some parts of it especially can be more touchy than others. With that said, I'm going to allow the panel to introduce themselves. I'm going to call on you in the order that I see you on my screen. First up, I have Dr. Parris Malone. If you want us to give us a brief intro into who you are and what you do.
Sure. As you pointed out, I'm Dr. Parris Malone. I currently work in metro schools. As a history teacher, I've taught the second portion of world history, 500 to 1500, as well as early American history, which of course we know covers a bit of what are some touchy subjects for us. I am also originally from Memphis, Tennessee, moved here to Nashville to attend Tennessee State University, and then I also attended Trevecca. I have been in education about 7 years now. My bachelor's degree is in history, so I think I know a little something about the topic.
Thank you so much, Dr. Malone. Dr. Malone is one of my good friends. Ironically, we sat next to each other at graduation, so we go way, way, way back. Next up, I have Dr. Bryson McGuire. If you wanted to give us a few words about you and your credentials.
Great. Thank you so much, Ms. Jones. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Bryson McGuire. I am originally from Danville, Kentucky. That is about 30 minutes outside of Lexington, Kentucky. I held a bachelor's from the University of Louisville in political science and a master's in secondary education from the University of Kentucky, and also a doctorate in educational leadership from Lipscomb University. I've been in education for roughly about 6 years. The first part of my career I spent in Kentucky teaching an array of subjects such as global issues, which is a government course, AP Human Geography, US history, and also African American history. I relocated to Nashville, Tennessee, where I taught 8th grade history, which is American history at this point. So I'm so glad to be here. I currently serve Metro Nashville Public Schools as a Dean of Students and as an administrative role. And like Ms. Jones, I didn't sit by Dr. Malone at graduation, but my first year here in Nashville, we did have the opportunity to sit next to each other at an in-service day to where we were working together for 8th grade social studies. So happy to be here, and thank you all for having me.
Thank you so much. And our last but not least is Miss Rachael Finch, who I have worked with on many occasions. If you wanted to give us a few words about yourself as well.
Yes. So it's wonderful to be a part of this panel, and thank you to Bridget for asking me to participate today. My name is Rachael Finch, and I'm the Executive Director of the Historic Franklin Masonic Hall Foundation in Franklin, Tennessee. And I'm also going to be transitioning out of that role and into a new role starting in January as the Chief Preservation Officer for the Heritage Foundation of Williamson County. Yay! But still being able to consult with the Historic Franklin Masonic Hall Foundation on that project. I have a background in history and political science. I'm originally from New Orleans, born and raised. So who dat to all of the Saints fans that may be listening today. And by way of Denver, lived in Denver for 13 years, received my undergrad in history and political science. from University of Colorado, Denver, as well as a dual degree from Metropolitan State University of Denver. And then I moved here in 2006 so I could attend Middle Tennessee State University, and I'm a graduate of their master's program in public history with an emphasis in historic preservation, cultural resource management, and administration of historical organizations. So I've never physically taught in the classroom, but I do come from a family of educators. My younger sister is a history teacher, as was my mother before she retired. So I'm very well versed in history, and I've spent a lot of my professional career either researching history with the Tennessee Civil War National Heritage Area before transitioning into an executive director role. But I've always been very much about historic sites, really taking that role in presenting transparent and authentic history, representing all aspects of the story. And so I'm very glad to be here today to be a part of sharing in this conversation. So thank you again.
Thank you so much. Well, I'm really appreciative to all of our panelists today. I'm going to go ahead and jump into our content here. Now, I completely understand how difficult teaching African American history can be. In my time at Belmead, I served as the Director of African American Studies. And when you're starting to talk about things, especially concerning enslavement, things can get really, really touchy. Things can be quite emotional, and it can be emotionally charged as a result. So when for those of you who have been classroom teachers, what are some of the biggest challenges that you face when you're teaching African American history?
I would say some of the biggest challenges for me when I was in the classroom was dealing with language, because of course, you want to pull in some primary sources, and those primary sources are going to have some strong language that can be offensive to some. Also dealing when you get to looking at images and videos, just as the subject can be touchy, the things that they're looking at can be touchy. So those are some of the biggest challenges that I faced. But to curb that, I think one of the best things that you can do is work on relationships with your students. So coming into the year, I always explain to my students, we're going to talk about some tough things this year. We may see a primary source where someone may be reading aloud and may have to say a word or may get to a word that they don't feel comfortable saying, or that may be offensive to someone. We may see some images that may be offensive to someone or hurtful, but it's to learn the content and to learn about things about our past, because we can't change them, they happened. But also explaining and being firm that we're not going to make jokes about these things. We're not going to use these terms to be offensive to anyone. They are just simply here as tools to learn from. If you show that you're uncomfortable with teaching it, kids can kind of feed off of you, kids feed off of you. And so I just say to curb those challenges, to just set that platform and make it firm in the beginning that this is what it is, and this is what I will accept, and this is what I won't accept as it relates to those heavy topics.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I'm kind of going along with what Dr. Malone had said. You know, ironically, when I was in the classroom and teaching African-American history as it pertains to slavery, my struggles and challenges were not with the students due to the fact that I had developed those relationships with students. However, my challenges were usually with the parents of those said students because essentially when we're looking at a textbook, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, textbooks are generally written or constructed by a single story, right? And usually that single story does not look like Dr. McGuire. And so now having to navigate how to teach subjects such as enslavement or the Civil War from the perspective of a Black man, that was where I ran into challenges because now not only do we have to worry about language and actually the content to which we're teaching, we also have to look at at cycles of socialization, you know, how people were taught, how they come to learn what is correct, how they were educated, how parents were educated. And we're living in certainly a very progressive generation with our students to which we are rearing now. But when we still have work to do as it pertains to levels and systems of privilege and oppression, then we really have to make sure that we are navigating correctly how we introduce said topics such as enslavement. So for me, I love relationships, and I'm grateful to where we were able to have relationships with students. But for me, my biggest challenges were dealing not with the backlash from going home, and also divulging and discussing some of the content to which we had to discuss as it pertains to enslavement in African American history in our classroom.
I wholeheartedly agree. I know that we definitely had issues with parents as far as it came to visiting Belle Meade, and especially concerning visiting Belle Meade to only hear about the history and the legacy of slavery. You definitely would have a lot of parents say, well, what parts of slavery are you going to talk about? Well, we're going to talk about all of the parts, because we're not really teaching if we're only teaching the comfortable parts. And I think when we're talking about enslavement, we've gotten very comfortable with only talking about the comfortable parts. But growth is not rooted in comfort, it's rooted in uncomfort. So until you're uncomfortable, you are not growing. Now, this question I'm going to pose a little bit closer to Rachael, because she has a very specific focus as well, being more on the museum side of things. So from your experience, how can museums and other cultural institutions assist teachers in telling these stories?
That's a really good question. I think some of the best ways that historic sites and museums can truly assist teachers and even parents who may have homeschooled children when they come to visit is, providing materials even prior to field trips, if we're looking at just bringing children to a site, and also kind of having those conversations offline with the teachers or parents of homeschoolers prior to the visit, so they're aware of the subject matter that will be told on the tour. I know I said that I work for the Historic Franklin Masonic Hall Foundation. So Masonic Hall, yes, it is a Masonic Hall. It still functions as a lodge for Hiram Lodge number 7. So there are still Masons who meet there. But the challenge in interpreting the history is really going beyond what we know today of Freemasonry and going back into the early 19th century and discussing who even constructed that building. And so it started coming in and really changing the narrative. We were the first site really in Williamson County to say, because the building was commissioned by this particular person, or in the case of the Masonic Hall was commissioned by the Masons to be built. However, the building was constructed with the use of enslaved labor. And I think it's important to even use the word enslaved. Some would probably disagree and say, no, we should use the word slave versus enslaved. Slave would have been used in the 19th century. Enslaved is what we bring humanity into the situation. But I think we have to also teach humanity in the humane when we're at a historic site or when we're at a museum, because most individuals, even today in our postmodern 21st century, really do not have a grasp on the severity of the period of enslavement, let alone really understanding the period of Reconstruction into Jim Crow and civil rights. I know this when we're giving tours, we have more children who understand enslavement more so than Reconstruction and Jim Crow. And so what we do is bridge that gap and provide materials to the teachers as resources to allow them to understand what's really going on the local level. Because I think nationally, we teach the national history, the national story, while very difficult to digest on so many levels, is somewhat easier to digest because, again, it's a national story. When we're looking at enslavement during the antebellum period or the Civil War to Reconstruction and the United States colored troops and the triumphs that come from the war into early periods of Reconstruction. But yet we're missing the local level history. We're not really engaging teachers with the resources that they need at the local level to be able to translate what was going on locally to then connect those dots from a state perspective in state history to then tie those dots into the national history. So I think historic sites have an obligation, particularly now, to really hone in on what was going on locally. who was in charge of, the county court and your local city government, and who from your county was sitting in the General Assembly in Nashville for the state of Tennessee, and what political parties were they a part of, prior to the war and even after the war. How did that affect the local political and socioeconomic areas? I mean, Williamson County was the third largest slaveholding county in Tennessee by 1860. And when we tell people that on the tour, it kind of just takes the air out of their sails. They think that Williamson County is this wonderful county and it's so beautiful, and Franklin has this tremendous Main Street, which is not to take away from what Franklin has done to really become a heritage tourism destination. However, I think if we're going to, talk about one thing and demonstrate one thing, then our historic sites have an obligation to meet that area that's really lacking from where the story is. And, I think several of our historic sites are doing a good job on where they were versus where they are today. But I think that everyone can continue to just build upon what we're doing by, first of all, also reaching out to our local schools. Who is your curriculum specialist? Whether or not, historic sites kind of thrive on the field trips, but with COVID, we've realized, guess what? People aren't going to be, school kids aren't coming. So how can you reconnect, or how can you, connect even on a deeper level with your Williamson, or like in our case, the Williamson County students and teachers? But it's getting to know who your curriculum specialist is. Do you have any connections within, your central school office at the county level that can help, kind of be that go-between person that will help elevate your historic site to be able to engage with teachers. Teachers are so busy. Teachers have a tremendous job, and they're already faced with a lot of pressures. So what we have done over the past few years is just really build a deep relationship with our Williamson County curriculum social studies specialists. And through that, we've been able to then build teacher institutes and do all-day PDs during the summer, or do a summer teacher institute where we have specialists come in and speak, and then they get a very deep immersion into difficult history tied to period of enslavement through civil rights and beyond. So I think those are ways that could really help benefit not only the local community teachers, but also how the historic sites are sharing that history at the same time.
Absolutely. And I wholeheartedly agree. I think that institutions like museums definitely have an obligation to assist teachers in teaching these very, in many cases, uncomfortable subjects. So when we start to look at these institutions, understand that we are your partner. And if we can assist, we will, especially plantation museums and museums like Rachael, where she's at the Masonic Hall. I think there's power in place. So when you take students to see these places in these spaces where people have historically been disenfranchised and discouraged, I think it's easier for students to grasp the topic, and adults too, for that matter, when they're actually sitting in that specific place. Now, along with place, you also have to think about activities that can really pull students into the subject matter, because the content can fall on deaf ears. Everyone doesn't learn in the same way. That's something that you learn when you're studying to be a teacher. So what are some of the activities that you all have used with your students that you feel have been successful with teaching African American history?
I'll point to one activity that I used every year that I taught 8th grade U.S. history. I think just as important as it is to teach the ills and the sorrows and the struggles that they face, I think it's just as important to highlight some of the triumphs that African Americans were able to make. So one of my favorite activities for the year, which is, and I will say this, let me preface this by saying don't go too far, but this was not necessarily aligned as an actual standard, but I always close the year doing a lesson on Juneteenth. Most of my kids have no clue what Juneteenth was, why does it matter, and when I explain to them that this is something that takes place a good time after the war has actually ended, and why they celebrate it, the ways in which they celebrate it, how those celebrations died down, and the students, they pull into it like, wow, this is a time that these groups of individuals were able to come together. They put on their Sunday best. They basically had these community events. They had red soda and they had this, and the ways in which that kind of ties into things that other groups of people, as you say, like most of them don't really understand the piece about Reconstruction, where they tie those things where they were, oh, they got together and they had red soda and they had watermelon, and you take this and you flip it and give it a negative connotation. And then you go years without having people celebrate this event, to the point now it's 2020 and kids are like, what? June? I mean, I know 4th of July, but I don't know Juneteenth. So that was one of my favorite activities to incorporate throughout the year. So what I would do is have the kids to, of course, introduce the topic to them, have the kids to do some research on their own. And then their final culminating task would be to write an argument to their local legislator on why Juneteenth should or should not be a federal holiday.
I love that. Oh my gosh. As a person that does a lot of programming around Juneteenth, that's definitely beneficial to the students to make sure they understand the relevance behind the day. Dr. McGuire, I see you took your mute off. I know you got something for me.
So 2 things came to my mind. We always, before I started digging into slavery, I always did a standardized unit on diversity as a whole. Because when I'm getting ready to start talking about marginalized groups of people, such as African Americans or Black history, I also wanted students to be able to look at systems of oppression and this idea of stereotypes. So before we started, I stood at my door. I had labels, and I called it the labeling exercise. And so on those labels were different groups of people. So on one may say a Black man. Another label may say a Muslim. Another label may say a convicted felon. Another label may say a gay man or a lesbian or an athlete, right? And as soon as students walked in, I placed a label on their back. Students did not know that label, which was on their back. Other students did not tell them the label that was on their back, but they each sat in different seats with the label on their back. And when they sat down in these groups, they then had to be interviewed, or they were asking each other, their group members, questions such as, what will your parents say about me? Would you take me to your house of worship? Would you be seen with me outside? Because what this was really, really showing is that these students were beginning to expose themselves and the stereotypes that they already had concerning these groups of people, right? And so what I love is when the students that were asking the questions, you know, would you take me here? Would you take me there? They then began to make guesses or assumptions. Well, I think I'm this person. And it was amazing how many of them would get it right. And it showed us that stereotyping and these systems of oppression are a reality, right? And so I segue that into that by saying, hey, now what does this teach us about how we actually view groups of people, right? What does this tell us about systems of oppression? And what does this teach us about how others view these types of people, particularly marginalized groups of people? And then we segue that into talking about slavery, and then continue on to the curriculum that we developed as a means to talk about African American history. And also within that curriculum, I love to do what we refer to as inquiry-based projects or inquiry-based instruction, where students will have what we refer to as essential questions, and they will view a number of sources, whether they be primary or secondary, in the means to be able to answer what we refer to as essential questions. So one of my favorites that I constructed, the essential question was, is assimilation elimination? And essentially what students were looking at is this idea of assimilating into a dominant culture. Does that mean in an effort to assimilate, do I then have to eradicate my culture that I come with, you know? And again, so I take that into African American history, but I first start broad as a means to look at a collective of marginalized groups of people, and then transition us into African American history and use resources that provided by either that I find myself through Teaching Tolerance, the C3 framework, or PBS Teaching Lounge, or things that I've used, as my mother would say, down through the years.
I love that. And I honestly always say, if I would have had the types of teachers that are being produced today, I think there would have been a lot more people that were interested in history today. Because a lot of the problem with the interest in history, especially as a professional field, lies in the teacher. If your teacher does not make it interesting, then you will find it to be boring. Even me with a history degree had boring history teachers at times. So I appreciate your ability to make it interesting and relevant to the students and their lives. Now, on the museum side, we have a different way of kind of having to do these things because we don't have students on a regular basis. So Rachael, what's one of your activities that you use?
So one of the things that we use is the physical building itself, and also the landscape surrounding it. The building was originally constructed in 1823, so it's the oldest three-story building still standing in downtown Franklin. It's a National Historic Landmark, so it is the place where the Chickasaw leaders of the Chickasaw Nation met with Andrew Jackson and John Eaton and John Coffey and negotiated for their removal to lands west of the Mississippi River. So the Treaty of Franklin was signed there with those Chickasaw leaders, as well as John Eaton, John Coffey, and members of Nashville and Franklin political society. I think where we kind of get it wrong is everybody thinks Andrew Jackson was there and he signed the treaty, and that's not the case. So what we like to do is always debunk the myths surrounding this building and the myths surrounding Franklin and Williamson County and the myths that tie into the national story. Again, Jackson signing the treaty. Jackson was president. Yes, he was there at the time and negotiated, but he didn't sign it. But it was part of his administration. So how do we kind of break down those walls and really talk about an extremely difficult period of history when we're looking at American Indian removal, as well as the African American enslaved of those American Indians who were owned by the American Indians, whether they're Chickasaw, Choctaw, Cherokee, Creek, Seminole, and how did that affect them? So we use that first floor of the hall to really kind of bring that history to life. And then we always go outside and really encourage people to put their hands on the wall and see where the fingerprints and the bricks are from the enslaved people who built that building, men, women, and children. We have a few bricks where you can tell that there were enslaved children that put their fingers in the bricks. And that is probably one of the most impactful and empowering moments of the tour, because that's usually when we see most people's veils just lift. And it makes sense to them. The wrought iron fence that is out in front of the Masonic Hall, I know Bridget's familiar with this, but if for those who are not, the wrought iron fence was put up by the Masons of Hiram 7 in 1868 in response to the race riots that took place in Franklin in July of 1867. The interesting thing, though, about 2nd Avenue South, where the Masonic Hall sits today, is that right after the war, that whole area becomes a working class African American neighborhood. So what does it mean to have a wrought iron fence just go across the front entrance of your building? It really says this is our space and that is your space. You don't cross this threshold without any permission. And even if you did have permission, you never would come in the front door. An African American would have always gone around to the side or the back. So it's again, one of those teaching tools that we use, because so many people walk down 2nd Avenue South to get to Main Street. They don't give it any second thought. They just think it's a piece of wrought iron decoration that was put up at some time in Franklin, then it goes with the building. They have no idea that within the Masonic records that it specifically talks about that. And so on tour, we not only bring in the reason why the wrought iron fence is so symbolic today, but we talk about the realities for those white men in 1867. Most of them are former Confederate veterans. Most of them were slaveholders. Several of them, though, were not. Many of them were Southern Unionists that were also slaveholders. They all have these different perspectives. But yet, the most gripping thing about Freemasonry is that Freemasonry, whether it's taught today or 200 years ago, is that it's about the Enlightenment period and making a good man into a better man. It's always about making yourself into a more impactful human being to better society. And in reality, 3 of the original 6 Ku Klux Klan members of Williamson County were Masons of that lodge. So how do we rationalize today when we see the Klan very active in different ways in our culture, or neo-Nazi groups that participate in white supremacy? And how do we tie that in very delicately to the past? Because I think the past always informs the present and vice versa. And we really just stick with facts. We just tell that history and we're very transparent about it. I think the most important thing is to never throw one group completely under the bus, because as our jobs as public historians, we're there to interpret the history and present it transparently and authentically. And then we want to continually have an interpretive conversation where we pose questions to students, or we pose questions to those who come and take a regular tour to, how do you see this happening? What do you think would have happened if this would have been different? And then we, if anyone takes our specialty cultural landscape tour, we always go down Second Avenue to the public square, which today there is a large Confederate monument that stands in the center of the square. If anybody has followed the news the past year, Franklin's put up multiple Civil War trail markers that talk about Reconstruction through the Jim Crow era. And those have been met with a lot of positivity, but they've also been met with a lot of resistance from certain heritage groups. So there is no marker that talks about the specificities of why there is a Confederate monument in Franklin. However, that doesn't stop us from telling that story and tying in, once again, the Masonic Hall's place, because of the Masons, to the Confederate monument, because so many of them gave money for that construction of the monument to be there. So I think that there's such, an immersive way for us as museum professionals at historic sites to be able to bridge that gap and provide meaningful conversations, because that's what this really is. I don't like going somewhere and paying $20 for a tour and I just got stuff regurgitated to me that I could have just read on their website. I want to go and take Bridget's tour, because I read a little bit about what she was doing at Belmead, and it's like, oh, well, this is something that inspires me to learn about what it was like at a period of time for a group of individuals who had no say. They had no voice. And what I think is the most impactful thing that our organization has done, and what I'm looking forward to doing with the organization that I'm about to step into, is that we have the ability to give a voice to the voiceless. And I think to be able to do that in such a time as this, particularly in 2020, where everything has been so chaotic, whether it's due to a pandemic or to the politics of our country, we have just an enormous opportunity to seek teachers and students and meet them where they are and provide them with resources that they really can't get anywhere else unless they just go to the national sites like Library of Congress or National Archives. I think the State Museum does a tremendous job on providing resources for teachers, but I also think that historic sites and museums should partner with our state museums and institutions to kind of bridge that gap too, because there are times where I would love to have information and I don't always have access to it. So I think those are certain tools that we could benefit from as well. But those are the things that I think are the most impactful, where you can just really bring that healing about when you're on a tour, and just sticking your hands on an enslaved person's fingerprints from nearly 200 years ago is something that I've seen grown men cry over, something that I never thought I would see. And so when I see that taking place, it means that they're having an experience with the past that no words that I could say would ever make a difference. It's really that experience.
Absolutely. I agree with that as well. I know for Belmead, we did some very intriguing things concerning going into the slave cabins, into the quarters, and actually allowing students to see how they lived, asking you if that cabin is 10 by 10, but I'm telling you that 8 people lived in this one house. How do you reconcile with that at 13? How do you reconcile with that at 14? We carefully curated some interesting programming. The tour that we created was called Millie and Monroe, which focused on the lives of 2 enslaved children. So we're looking at slavery through the eyes and through the lens of children themselves and giving them an idea of slavery from their own perspective, something that they could relate to age-wise, as well as doing something called Historian for a Day, where we're taking primary source documents, putting them in the hands of children and letting them decipher what they mean for themselves. For example, we would use Langston Hughes's I Too Sing America and let the students break down what is he saying in this poem and what does it mean for him as a Black man to say, I too sing America, in a time where America wasn't really claiming someone that looked like Langston Hughes. So activities are definitely extremely important. Now, when you put all this together, you should start to see some benefits from it. So what are some of the long and short-term benefits that you've seen just from incorporating more African-American history into your instruction?
I've seen my kids become, at that point, more engaged. Again, when you introduce topics to them the way in which you did, or allowed them to kind of lead their own learning. Even in looking at, I gave my kids a pie graph that showed the percentages of people at the time who would have owned slaves, those who did, those who didn't. And just to see them begin to make the connections, well, only 1% of people at that time would have had a large plantation that we're used to seeing, for them to say this is what slavery was. And then being able to make connections, well, they still call the wealthiest people in the room, or in the world, or in the US, the 1%. Is there a connection there? Or being able to see the number of whites who did not own slaves, and to find out that, okay, now they're free. And so you're saying they're the same as us. So just seeing my students take the connection, make the connections, get active in their own learning, like that's the biggest thing for me. I am not, or was not, because I'm not in the classroom anymore, but I was not a sit and get teacher. I wanted my kids to get involved. I didn't do the flip classroom, you do your research on your own and then you're going to come in. No, I didn't do it that way. But we were going to have some discussions. We're not taking notes. I never, if my kids had a textbook, I was not at work that day. I didn't teach from a textbook. I did not run off and just say, I'm going to make my own curriculum because I know everything. But I also, there's not much that my child can get from a section review. And when I say my child, I mean my students. Those were my babies. There's nothing they can get from a section review. If that's the case, why am I here? If I want you to read chapter 1 and answer the 5 questions that somebody who's probably never been in a classroom made up for you to answer because they feel like it's important. No. So the biggest thing for me is just seeing my kids get engaged and making those connections, to the point like they're asking their English teacher, well, Dr. Malone mentioned this in her class. Can we read this book for your class? Because I want to know more about it. So now I'm working with the English teacher. She's like, can you give me a source? Because I can pull my English from whatever you're doing. So just seeing my kids like get into it. And I was at a school in North Nashville, which we know, or some of us know about the 37208 area code, which is an area that has the highest incarceration rate out. So this is it's a group of students who you don't often see get into a subject, but literally it was funny. My principal would joke about it, like the kids didn't do their English homework, but they had social studies. Oh, I know, because I pulled them in.
No, she's absolutely right.
Yeah.
I did my student teaching under Dr. Malone, and those kids love that class. So yeah, I agree. Dr. McGuire, I know you got something good too.
Dr. Malone jogged my memory. It is amazing what students who score low on literacy, low on numeracy, and when they see themselves in instruction and in the curriculum, it is amazing what their achievement will look like. And I noticed that students who identify as Black, how much their achievement rose and scores rose when they actually could identify with the curriculum to which they could teach. Gloria Ladson-Billings, she talks about culturally relevant pedagogy and using cultural reference as a means to be able to be a vehicle for children's instruction. So I always found it so loving when a Black student particularly would then, a student that I saw never wanted to read. I mean, baby, they was reading today, because they were actually able to identify with the work to which now they are having to do. And it's amazing to see how scores began to improve. And so number one, I say that the short-term benefit is not only establishing a relationship, but providing instruction and curriculum and resources to which your students can see themselves in, and then to be able to have that benefit of watching them be able to gain success. Not only Black students, but I loved when students, particularly white students, would also grab a hold to the instruction. Certainly we understand this is an election year, and a few months past, we were dealing with a lot of turmoil in our country as it pertains to the Black Lives Matter movement, and all these different organizations were beginning to surface, right? And I had a student, he reached out, and I have two Instagrams. One is an educational based Instagram to where I allow students to follow me when we did a lot of work in our classroom with social media. And he tagged me in a story that he did on Instagram. And he was talking about our class and how he was watching some of the things going on in the news. And he made a statement that I loved. And he said, it's all happening because of one single story. And I would like to thank him for that, because now I can use that knowledge to speak up and say something about it, while also educating others with the things that he taught me. And I think that that's what we desire for our students, right? For us to be able to teach them, for them to be not only Black students, but white students, Hispanic students, Asian students, for us to teach them about levels and systems of oppression, about the reality of the society to which we live in, and then for them to be able to take what we taught as a means to be able to advocate for other marginalized groups of people. So in the long term, and he is now graduating, because I taught high school, he is now graduated and now in his first year of college, and just participated in an election year. And so I'm really, really grateful for that. That is a benefit that I hold dearly. And it lets us know that while we teach, and while it seems like sometimes as teachers, the words that we say may fall on deaf ears, but to know that our labor is not in vain is certainly a benefit for them and myself. So I'm really, really grateful for that experience. And I'm prayerful that I touch someone else, or that he touches someone else when he becomes a professor or a teacher, because we're rooting for that too.
I already know it. I can see it. I can see the passion that both of you have for this field. And as a person that started out attempting to be a teacher and quickly realized that that was not God's will for my life, I put you guys on such a high pedestal, because it requires so much patience and work to do this job and do it well. Now, I'm going to make this my final question, because I do want some questions if you all have any questions, but this is something that I know many teachers struggle with. It's something that I struggled with in school, attempting to become a teacher. What are some techniques that you guys recommend, including to achieve more instruction, especially pertaining to African American history, when you have more standards than you have time, especially when you're trying to teach a test?
Go ahead.
Okay. I focus on the thing, and you normally hear it with like ELA or math, like power standards. And I know they tell you don't teach to the test. Child, your license depend on it. Okay. So the state breakdown gives you like what percentage of the test is, or what percentage of the standards are going to weigh more than others, which obviously you want me to teach to the test, because you wouldn't tell me that if you didn't really want that. So just focusing in on making sure that you drive in those standards that are going to be more important. There are some things that are going to take days at a time, because Tennessee loves to give us some standards with 50, 11 commas, and do this and this and this and this and this, and then put 17 bullet points under it, you probably want to spend a little bit more time on that than you would on a standard that says something very specific. I remember we had one that was just like, make sure the kids knew that, I don't know, the sky was blue. Like some of them can be that simple, and then some of them are very elaborate. So obviously you want to spend more time on the standards that are elaborate, and to address those, the desire to include more stories about African Americans, about Hispanic and Latino Americans. Look at what's going on at that point. If I have this grand overview standard that I'm going to probably spend 3 to 5 days on anyway, how can I then incorporate these marginalized groups into talking about that? If I'm going to spend 5 days on it, I'm obviously won't spend the whole 5 days addressing the ways in which whatever standard that I'm addressing at the time covered or impacted marginalized groups, but I can dedicate a class period to it. I can dedicate a bell ringer to it. I can dedicate a homework assignment, a short reading, something. There are ways in which it doesn't have to be overkill. And I feel like that's where a lot of people go wrong. And oh, I nope, got to talk about a Black person today. No, it's not. It doesn't have to be that way. You want to still cover the content, but just find ways that you can naturally flow the information into whatever it is you're covering. For example, they tell us to cover Reconstruction. They don't necessarily say cover Juneteenth. I just know that that's a way, as a result, takes place after the Civil War, ties in very easily to Reconstruction. I can easily slide that in towards the end of the school year. So just finding ways that it naturally works. Don't force it. Don't be the people in the news who take the activities and want to bring these issues to life. Like, no, that is not how you teach touchy subjects. You stick with the facts. The kids don't need to feel it. If you teach it right, they'll feel it. Don't force it.
Yeah, and I would agree with Dr. Malone. One thing that I always try to do is I talk less and I let them talk more. And so I allow student voice to really, when I was in the classroom, I allowed student voice to really mold the way that we had discussions concerning African-American history or any type of ethnic history, such as I think that Miss Finch had spoke about Masonic law, Masonics and Freemasonry. Well, my great-grandfather was a member of Prince Hall. And so I bring that back into this idea of Masons, right? And so I try my best to find different avenues to where I can also relate to the information to which we provide and that students can relate. Earlier, I spoke about this aspect of culturally relevant pedagogy. And a lot of times we look at CRP as another checklist of things. So as Dr. Malone said, oh, I've got to talk about this today, or I've got to talk about that today, right? And I think that a lot of times we can integrate in multicultural information into the standards to which we already have. It just takes a little bit more digging, right? Where we allow ourselves to have differentiated activities that we can see all of our students in, right? It may be a reading assignment. I apologize for that beep. That's all these meetings that I'm getting invitations from all my teachers for S-teams and IEP meetings. It's almost the end of the quarter. But again, this idea of trying our best to differentiate some of the activities to which we provide for our students. And the tendencies say that the standards do give us curriculums and some activities to be able to use, but it's really going to take an extra push on our end as educators to find differentiated instruction, such as readings, excerpts, different sources to which we can use, because we really want our students to reach that level of achievement. And if we want all students to reach that level of achievement, we have to make sure that all students can see themselves in our instruction. Rita Pearson says that students don't learn from people they don't like. And I would also go a little bit closer to say students don't achieve from curriculum they cannot identify with. Right? So when we're giving them curriculum that they cannot see themselves in, to which they cannot identify, it's going to be kind of hard for them to reach levels of achievement sometimes, particularly African-American students who statistically are already at a disadvantage to all their other peers, right? So we have to make sure that we find ways to differentiate our instructions, find activities to which all students can identify with, and really, really be strategic with the practices that we use in our instructional practices.
I just want to piggyback on what you said real quick. Again, back to what I was saying about not forcing it. You got to realize, like, we're talking about events of the past. So it's not like these events happened in isolation. Whatever happened yesterday, it happened yesterday. It was on national news, and in some way it impacted Black people, white people, Latinos. It impacted all of these groups of people. So when you look at an event like, I don't know, let's say Manifest Destiny, that's a big topic for 8th grade. How does it impact various groups of people? Then you're not forcing it like, okay, let me get it in. Like, no, just look at, this is the time period that this event happened. What's going on with this group of people? What's going on with this group of people? And you just tie that into your content.
I love it. Y'all have given some amazing tips and outlooks on how to better educate your students. And then for mine and Rachel's case, especially adults too, in many cases, could use some instruction on the past.
Yeah, I feel like adults, you know, my parents' generation is the baby boomer generation, and they learned a completely different history than what I learned as a Gen X. And then obviously my children. I've got 2 that are getting ready to graduate from high school, so, and 2 that are in college. So it's interesting to see not only how I interacted as a teenager with different groups of individuals, but to see my kids have a different perspective on people of color, simply based on how we were raised in the education system and the culture we grew up in. It is so different. And I think there's a lot of benefits for that. And now kind of stepping into this new role coming at the very beginning of next year, I found out that my new charge is going to be leading the way on the restoration and interpretation of the last remaining Rosenwald school that is standing in Williamson County. And so that's going to be a really transformative period again. And it's also a big jump for the Heritage Foundation of Williamson County, because this is something that they've never done before, and really taking that that momentum of, you know, almost 30 years ago, saving the Macklemore House, which is now owned by the African American Heritage Society. And now the Heritage Foundation has actually purchased this school to fully restore it and to tell the African American history of it, but how it also ties in again to Williamson County's African American experience. I think that's just going to be a very unique experience for someone like me, who is clearly not African American. But I have a passion for telling that history, because growing up in a melting pot like New Orleans and seeing you know, a lot of prejudice against African Americans, I feel as a historian, it's incumbent upon me to ensure that there is no stone left unturned in interpreting the difficult histories of our past and making them relevant in the present, because that's how we learn. That's where the reconciliation will come. And hopefully that's where the education happens. You know, education builds character. If we can instill character within our students and our teachers, I think when they come to historic sites, to then bring that back to the classroom and empower teachers to make a difference with the information that historic sites can provide or historic organizations can provide, then, you know, and always knowing that they have a resource in us, teachers knowing that they can come and trust the historic sites in their local community, or trust the State Museum to give them the tools that they'll need to be impactful in the classroom. I think is the most important thing that we can do to inspire educators, because I know that there are some educators who just feel like they're out on an island and they're like, what do we do? Where do we go for these resources? And they're already swamped with having to meet these state standards. To Dr. Malone's point, Dr. McGuire's point, there's a lot of state standards, and I don't have the first clue as to what teachers really go through in the classroom, but I know that teachers work diligently to ensure that their children learn. And I think that this is where the museum historic site community can really make a difference in the lives of our educators, who will make a difference in the lives of our students in our county schools. If we can step up as public historians and really say, this is where the rubber meets the road, and provide the information, primary source, secondary source, and also just keep that relationship going. You know, open up those doors, encourage your curriculum specialists or some of these teachers to come and sit on your foundation boards or your museum board, or come and be a guest speaker at your museum or a guest lecture series. I think that there's a lot of opportunity for teachers to share, particularly those that are very motivated to kind of do both and be very active in public history as well as the classroom.
Absolutely. Well, do we have any? Oh, I see someone here. Rosa said that what are the best topics to search for and or locations to search for Tennessee history to incorporate more resources that reflect the whole of our history? We need help in this area. We can say museums and TSLA, etc. But how can we get this to teachers in a workable format? What are some of the best topics or locations? Do you guys have any?
Well,
Yeah.
Oh, Dr. Malone, you go.
There is the East Tennessee Historical Society, and watch me give the wrong web address. I want to say it's like teachtnhistory.org, maybe. They were one of my favorite go-tos. They actually have like a breakdown of, and if I said this wrong, I will get with Bridget or somebody and have them to give you all the correct website. But I think it's teachtnhistory.org. They actually have articles that they have already created by grade level that address the Tennessee historical standards. They come in the form of various articles with essay questions, short answer questions. They may have the kids like fill in like a shoe because they were walking the path of somebody, but the content is already there. It already has an essential question, and I'm sure most of my teachers know what essential questions are. That groundwork is pretty much already done for you. If there is anybody on the call who is in Metro, it's actually already embedded into your scope and sequence for the district, which you can find, even if you don't teach in Metro. You can borrow our scope and sequence, and that website is ci.mnps.org, and I put that little plug in there because I worked on it. So there are multiple resources that are there available for you. As far as Tennessee standards, I liked the Teach TN history website. And then I never taught fifth grade, but I work as our social studies coach now. So I'm coaching our fifth grade teachers. The Tennessee History for Kids, those little booklets have proved to be pretty beneficial. They lean a little bit more towards the fifth grade standards than they did the eighth grade standards, but those were helpful.
I know the Tennessee State Museum, do they still do the trunks as well?
Yes.
Yes.
I was actually going to say, we have our trunk program, which can be sent out to classrooms. We have virtual field trips on early African American history and on civil rights. And we've actually just launched a kids blog this summer while we were kind of all locked up away from our offices due to COVID. We started a kids blog, which are written at a 4th or 5th grade level. And they tell a lot of different Tennessee history topics, including African American history as well. And you can get onto our kids page on our website and check that out, or you can just search for basic terms and be able to pull those also.
So several of our teachers at our school use the trunk program, as well as I also use, as I had prefaced, the C3 framework, which is inquiry-based instruction materials, and that can be found on their website. They have a plethora of already established workable stuff, PowerPoints, presentations, resources for you to be able to utilize in your classroom to be able to conduct inquiry-based learning. Also, I also use some of the resources on teaching tolerance on their website as well, which really, really lays out, and I think someone in the chat talked about the triggering emotions. I'm sure that they'll reference that comment, but it really, really breaks down how to navigate those sensitive conversations, and also how to provide those resources to students. And those are workable documents. So I would definitely go ahead and say, hey, check out the C3 framework and also teaching tolerance resources.
It looks like we're going to need to wrap up. We're right at our time, or actually a little over. But one last place you can look at for resources I'd really like to point out is the group that is putting on this series of workshops, Discover Tennessee History. And it is a group of several historic institutions that cover Tennessee history, and it's specifically aimed at teachers. So for those of you that were asking about primary sources, Teaching with Primary Sources, TSLA are members of that group, along with along with the State Museum and several others. So we kind of try to put all of our stuff in one place so you can kind of divide out from there as well. So that may help you kind of narrow your focus based on what each institution or organization really focuses on.
All righty. Well, thank you guys so much for coming. I'm going to drop my email in the chat for the rest of my panel, if you're open to doing that as well. I'm sure no one has a problem with helping you guys out if you need any help with teaching these subjects. So thank you guys so much for attending today. Chris, you can take us on home.
I just really want to thank all of our panelists for coming in and joining us and being available to all of us. Thank you so much for joining in. And Kira, is there anything else we need before we head out?
Yeah, just a couple quick housekeeping things, and let me pull my PowerPoint back up here real quick to share with you guys. So again, we'll be putting some of the links and things that were referenced today on the Padlet, so feel free to check that out. And then just to remember, this is not the last in the series. We will be meeting again on January the 12th with our partners at the East Tennessee Historical Society, who of course Dr. Malone mentioned with the teachtnhistory.org site. And then in February, Tennessee State Parks will be doing a session on the New Deal. And then in March, our last session will be our Teaching with Primary Sources program, and we're going to do a session on the Trail of Tears. You can register for any of those at the link there. And of course, we can share that link with you if you need that. And then very last, if you would take a moment to complete this survey, and we can drop this survey link in the chat box for you, but it would be helpful for us just to get your feedback on this session and some of our others. And that will also let you note if you would like a participation certificate for PD purposes. Again, thank you guys so much for your time and participation today. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you all for attending.
Bye.